Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Long COVID Web Town Hall meeting. Thank you very much for joining us. This is Karen. I'm the director for Long COVID Web, and I will be facilitating this meeting. First of all, we wish to acknowledge this land on which the Long COVID Web operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississauga of Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have this opportunity to work on this land. So before we all begin, just a few housekeeping items. First of all, please note that the meeting will be recorded and will be published on our website for those who have not been able to attend today. Secondly, we will keep everyone muted and the camera off during the presentation. And please feel free to use the chat box to type your questions at any time. We will be monitoring the questions and answering them in the chat box, and we will also get to the unanswered questions right after each presentation. You may be asked to unmute and elaborate on the question if needed. For the presentations, we have 15 minutes for the talk and 5 minutes for the questions. I will be showing a hand when there is 1 minute left for the presentation, so please be mindful of the time. So we have 3 presentations today, and the agenda will be posted on the chat soon, and it's showing on the screen here. So we will first go to the co-leads of Pillar 1 to provide Pillar 1 biomedical research updates, Drs. Gavin, Oudit, and Dr. Jim Russell.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Karen, for that wonderful introduction, and it's great to be part of our Town Hall meeting today. I'm very proud to be representing Pillar 1 with my colleague, Jim Russell. So I'll start off. I'm a cardiologist, clinician scientist here at the Masnikowski Alberta Heart Institute, University of Alberta. And so our Pillar 1 is really an integration of the clinical approach and a very basic biomedical animal model approach. And so this slide really nicely recapitulates that. So looking at what we have learned from our patients, and many of you were partners in this journey. So looking at the biomarkers, looking at how you're affected by COVID and the clinical, your phenotypes, and then trying to understand those biomarkers, and then going from there to be able to come up with new approaches, not only in terms of therapies, but also approaches in terms of prognosis and diagnosis. So diagnosis long COVID, prognosis is how, for example, you will do with your COVID. And we understand it can be quite variable. Some patients may have more cardiovascular respiratory complaints. Some may have more GI complaints. Some may have neurocognitive complaints, which seems to be probably the dominant system of complaints that they're affecting our patients now with long COVID. And so that's our approach, is really to bridge the basic and the clinical team together to be able to come up with new discoveries and new approaches for long COVID. So for my 7 minutes or so left, I'll demonstrate this using 2 examples. One is using patient samples. And this is a study we have done here in Alberta, where with the early wave, we collected samples from controls on patients with acute COVID and then follow them. So it's a longitudinal study, same group of patients. We followed them for about 7 months. So into the long COVID era, collected their biomarkers and phenotypes and look at their outcomes. And then we profile the biomarkers using 3 major platforms: cytokines, metabolomics, and proteomics. These are little signals in the plasma that tells us what's happening with COVID and long COVID. And so we picked up a lot of interesting signals, obviously coagulation pathways, the blood vessels. But what we saw very importantly was, of course, gut dysbiosis. But we saw a very interesting chemical metabolite called taurine that was affected. And so we were able to, using unsupervised clustering and machine learning, so artificial intelligence can get away without saying that word these days. We were able to use that to really validate how important taurine was in our long COVID scenario. And in fact, no matter how we look at it, whether it's traditional analysis or using AI and machine learning, taurine shows up in every single analysis we did. So the pathways on the left, you can see taurine and hypotaurine metabolism shows up. It's associated with symptoms. You can see in the middle panel there at the bottom, and associated with quality of life. So as part of our assessment, we were able to collect a comprehensive system on our patients, quality of life, and of course, hard clinical outcomes. So in each one of those scenarios, taurine showed up. And when we did an unbiased machine learning approach, it still held up. So without us doing any bias, letting the computer do its thing, through artificial intelligence, taurine was right up there. So it's quite fascinating that we're able to see the signature for taurine. And and it just happened that this happened right when this paper came out. This just came out in Science a month ago, showing that taurine is actually a driver of aging and senescence. And so we have actually worked on taurine several decades ago as part of my PhD. So quite a fabulous supplement, and it is something that you can take orally and is approved as a dietary supplement. So here they're showing that taurine is really important for prolonging life and may have a lot of beneficial effects. So based on these findings, we're actually just about to get the paper published, and we hope to be able to move quickly with your support into a trial looking at taurine. It's a dietary supplement, it's safe, it's approved, and I think this could be a big win for long COVID. It has a lot of metabolic, but also a lot of interesting neurotransmitter function, which could explain a lot of the neurocognitive changes we're seeing. So just a very nice early win for the biomedical clinical team, and using our patient samples to be able to tell us what's going on with patients. So part of that exploratory analysis is try to understand long COVID. And so you need animal models to be able to test this. Of course, you'll be testing taurine here, but also to test novel things. And here, we're very fortunate here in Edmonton to have the Canada first major level 3 facility. So we can do COVID, we can do this in mice and hamsters, which are our models. And here you can see that we can get nice weight loss in these animals. We can detect the virus in the lungs, in the heart, small intestine. COVID is everywhere, the virus is everywhere. It's not only in the lungs, right? And this is the problem with long COVID, right? The virus hijacked a receptor that's expressed widely. And those are images showing lung damage in our model. And very interestingly, one of the things we see is there's something in the gut. The ACE2 receptor is markedly lost when you have COVID. It goes away. And what that does, it triggers a lot of metabolic changes in the gut, and things that you absorb and things that are toxic to the body. Okay, so this is the gut microbiota piece, and this is quite fascinating, has been reported by others, but we're able to recapitulate here in a mouse model. And this is data from Dr. Emilio Falcone, one of our co-leads, where she took the gut samples from someone with long COVID and put it back in a mouse, and was a healthy mouse, and was able to show neurocognitive changes in that mouse model. So quite fascinating that you can take just the gut into a healthy mouse without COVID, and you can recapitulate so much of what happened with long COVID, certainly with the neurocognitive piece. So we think this is a big angle to explaining long COVID, certain aspects of it, and it brings into all sorts of issue, correcting the fecal microbiota, maybe fecal transplant, maybe role for probiotics, and understanding that connection. And so quite very exciting data. And we're looking forward to testing this further in our animal models, and of course, hopefully translating it into our patients. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gavin. Jim, you can start.
Yeah. So good morning, everyone, and thank you, Karen and others for joining, and it's a real pleasure. Gavin, I continue to be fascinated by the work you do, and I think people should know that this large long COVID web wouldn't have been possible without funding from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and it's allowed us to meet as scientists across the country and build a true team, and to be able to do work that wasn't possible before this very, very generous funding. Secondly, we've built already relationships that allowed us to start projects like Gavin just nicely showed, between individuals in different provinces and different centers and different provinces, medical centers, and in community hospitals. So the first message I would like to leave with everybody is this is a long-term project, but we hope to have some early wins, like Gavin said, and we need to be hearing from the patients about your concerns so that we aim our questions in the right direction. So I'm going to cover a few things here. I'll say, first of all, this is, again, another way to think of COVID. It's what I sometimes call in my field of research, which is sepsis, severe life-threatening infections, the COVID-friendly fire. There's not only the effects of the virus, which Gavin has nicely shown in the animal model, goes into almost every organ, but it's our body's response. So in this cartoon, we show, for example, patients might present with COVID pneumonia, severe enough to go to the emergency and be in the hospital. But then it triggers these complex reactions, which we still don't fully understand. Autoimmunity, where the immune system starts to attack our own organs, like the brain, the heart, and the lungs. Autoantibodies, which are fighting our organs and setting up the inflammation, coagulation, and creation of new blood vessels. It's a complicated term we call angiogenesis. And so it's not just the virus that's causing these long COVID problems, it's the response of the body, and it's hitting these major organs that we're all very fond of. We all like our brain, our lung, our heart, lungs, and our heart. And that's what leads to many of these symptoms. So our goal and our mission in Pillar 1 is to really build on strong science and hope to achieve, for all of you listening and across the world, indeed, a world-class set of solutions for better outcomes of long COVID. I'm going to highlight some work from Minali Mukherjee at McMaster, our own lab in UBC, and a lab at Western University from Doug Fraser. This is a study about the autoimmunity that I referred to, and autoimmune diseases are very, very prevalent. But what was interesting, this study from another group showed that all sorts of autoimmune diseases are much, much more common in patients with COVID. Inflammatory arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, spondylitis, another form of arthritis, and so on. And that was one of the first intriguing studies that suggested there's some connection, not well understood yet, between COVID and then autoimmune diseases. And indeed, they showed that this was more prevalent in the blue line for people to develop and have these autoimmune diseases than in the dotted line, people that didn't have COVID. So Dr. Mukherjee, who's a very young, astute, brilliant clinician, scientist in McMaster University in Hamilton, did a study with patients and with samples and scientists across Canada. And she really showed quite convincingly what are called anti-nuclear autoantibodies. So the nucleus is in the center of every cell but our red blood cells in the whole body. And they showed that these antibodies against our own nuclei and our own cells start circulating in people, and they predict, the levels predict the development of these long COVID symptoms. And these are the complex names. I don't even know what all these mean, but the point is they show that 3 months after getting COVID, high percentages of patients with long COVID have these so-called autoantibodies, one of which are these anti-nuclear autoantibodies. I'll move on to some of the work we've done in our own lab. We've been interested in COVID. We've had a very strong 25 publications, acute COVID, and now we've transitioned in the last year and a half to long COVID. We measured proteins at hospital admission, 3 months and 6 months. One of our questions was, it's known that females get long COVID more frequently and more severely than males, and it's not clear why. And this slide shows a number of proteins in red in females, in blue in males at admission, 3 months, and 6 months. And this is a control called pregnancy zone protein, which only occurs in females, much, much higher, as we expect. But these other proteins are higher in females over that time and are dramatically higher. And these intersect with all sorts of pathways that injure cells in the body. So we think this is a first clue to some of the reasons why females get long COVID more severely and more frequently than males. The other interesting part of this study is that we've been interested for about 10 years in what's called lipid biology. Lipids are the fats of our body. It's not just fat cells. Every cell in our body, and indeed bacteria, have lipid coats. And when we looked at these protein pathways in people with long COVID, this complicated picture, when analyzed by, as Gavin said, this artificial intelligence, the pathways that are turned on predominantly control the control of lipids across our body and within different organisms. And indeed, we've been the first in the world to discover a drug called PCSK9, very complicated term, PCSK9 inhibitors, which are used to treat the bad cholesterol, we've shown can also improve sepsis. And a trial of a PCSK9 inhibitor in Europe showed it decreased the mortality of acute COVID. So we're very excited proposing to test this therapy in long COVID. We think it can prevent the progression to long COVID and prevent the bad symptoms. The final study from Doug Fraser, brilliant work in Western University, also looking at proteins over time in the plasma in long COVID patients. And the pictures are pretty, and I'm not going to talk about the science, but what the pictures show is that healthy controls in green, long COVID patients in pink, and acute COVID patients in blue show quite different patterns of these protein measurements, whether you do it with a so-called heat map or these clustering algorithms, we call them. But he really showed very convincingly in this paper published in 2023 that protein clusters and combinations really differ between acute and long COVID. Well, so what? Why does that matter? Well, here's why it matters. Because some of those proteins tell us which drugs could be effective in long COVID. So these are the drugs that could potentially mediate what's called the hypoxia, low oxygen level pathway. That was one of the pathways turned on. So all of these drugs that are used in things like cancer, anemia, inflammation, cancer, anemia, cancer, diabetes, these are drugs being used for other conditions. And we use the term repurposing. So the possibility is that we could take one or more of these drugs and turn them to a new purpose to try to prevent long COVID. And so I want to thank Karen and our PI, Angela Chung, my colleagues who we're representing, Gavin and I are representing our funding, and then the different people behind the scenes on Gavin's and my team and the others that really make this possible. And I'll stop there, and I thank you all very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Gavin and Jim. So I see there's one question from the chat from Anne. Are there known interactions between taurine and some medications?
Yeah, so maybe I can answer that. So, I mean, there's always the potential for drug interaction. And what I can say is that this taurine supplementation has been used now for several decades. So, of course, they supplement in Red Bull together with lots of caffeine, which is an approved dietary supplement. So I think it's been shown to be relatively safe. There are dozens of studies on this. So I think the interaction is always a potential with any drug, never say never, but I think it's relatively safe and it can be taken with your other medications without any major drug interaction.
Gavin, Jim.
Hey, Gavin, I really enjoyed your talk. I think this is a very exciting opportunity. And I think people that are suffering long COVID, I've got 2 or 3 friends who have it fairly severely. And if they heard this talk, they would ask me to ask this question. Well, do we need a trial? Why would we need a trial? If it's inexpensive and over the counter, patients are going to say, why wouldn't I just go to a drugstore and start taking COVID? Take taurine to prevent long COVID. How do you think people should be advised? Who, unlike a prescription drug, people have a choice.
Yeah. Well, I think it's always good to have evidence to back what we do, especially if long COVID is obviously here to stay. It's affecting hundreds of thousands of people globally. And for us to recommend a therapy without evidence, I think it's careless. And so I think we understand the need to help our patients. That's why we are pushing as hard as we can. But we would love to get the trial data to suggest that it is beneficial. And I think it's great that people are excited about it. But we take this back now to our colleagues who are really well set up to do a trial. Like we have a long COVID trial network here in Canada, a few of them that Angela is leading with other colleagues. And so this would be, I've spoken to Angela already about this. We're just waiting for the paper to be accepted. But this is something that we can really move quickly in Canada and make it a Canada first trial of taurine supplementation for long COVID. So I think
my suggestion, I know this is always this tension between the best science and then what people really want to do quickly, is that I think people would be annoyed with us if the trial took 2 or 3 years. And if we do a trial, I think what we have to do is assure people we would move with haste and really try to get a modest sized trial that's convincing done as quickly as possible. And so maybe for the patients, volunteering to go into a trial, I think would be the way to help both the patient and your trial goals move quickly to answer the question.
Right, absolutely. And we'll make sure our outcomes are something that can be an early win too, even if it's just a surrogate outcomes for now, as we establish more long-term solid clinical outcomes.
There's one more comment from Jennifer. I personally have benefited from taurine. The main driver for trial is to know the dose, frequency, and the cost is not negligible. So with these questions, we will move on to the next talk. Please, everyone, feel free to type in your questions in the chat during the talk at any time. And if we need you to elaborate on any questions, we will help you to unmute. Thank you. So the next presentation is co-lead of Pillar 2, Jill Cameron.
Oopsie. All right, I think I've unmuted myself. So thanks for having us here today. And it's interesting to hear about all the work being done in Pillar 1. So I'm here on behalf of Grace and myself. We have just come into the co-chair roles this summer. So we're learning our way. So I'm going to give you a bit of a brief update on the activities that we've been involved in. So we actually had a Pillar 2 meeting this Tuesday. Grace and I are tag teaming. She's working clinically today, and I was in the classroom on Tuesday, so I wasn't unfortunately able to attend this meeting. We just had some updates for our group. Karen provided a nice update about the symposium to our group, where Kelly introduced the main project that's going to be supported by Pillar 2, and I'm going to go through that in some slides that they provided. We started talking about a webinar speaker series. I know that the Long COVID Web itself is going to have a speaker series that's going to be virtual, and we're looking at speakers from Pillar 2, but also I guess there was some discussion on Pillar 2 having its own series. So we're looking at that as another possibility, really just to share, and similarly to what Gavin and Jim just did, really sharing the findings of some of the work being done in the context of the pillar. A lot of the discussion was about identifying strategies to foster collaborations between investigators who are part of Pillar 2, So there's some discussion of creating a database of research interests that would be available on the Long COVID website. So people can go in and look for potential collaborators. I know we're going to hear from the patient group today as well. So it'd be interesting to match all of these people up who are interested in working and collaborating together on projects. There's also a call for proposal, which Karen provided some insight into. Other things, we're getting started with our regular meetings now with Grace and I as the new co-chairs. We're looking at Tuesday afternoons, and we'll hopefully be meeting monthly. So I'm going to provide you with an overview of the main project that's being undertaken in collaboration as part of Pillar 2. And I want to thank Kelly and Anne for providing these slides to share with the group today. So the overall aim is to establish a framework of long COVID measurement that includes relevant, valid, reliable, responsive, and feasible outcome measures to describe, evaluate, and predict health outcomes experienced among persons with long COVID, their family caregivers, for clinical research and for use in practice. So it's a very large team with multiple stakeholders, researchers, clinicians, people with lived experiences, and also an international collaboration with other groups who are looking at identifying core measurement outcomes in the context of long COVID. Apologize, things are popping up on my screen and I can't seem to get them to go. Anyway, sorry about that. Okay, so to provide some background and rationale, it's important to be able to have measure health outcomes using patient-reported outcomes to be able to identify and determine the nature and impact of health challenges, to understand the course of the condition, to understand and identify patient and caregivers' needs, to improve communication between providers, patients, and families, evaluating the effectiveness of interventions, and synchronizing patient-reported outcomes across projects by providing a framework is beneficial so we can synchronize across projects. We can also inform interventions. We can ensure that the measurements that are actually being used are safe to be used with the population. It will facilitate combination of results and in the context of systematic reviews and meta-analyses. Can also facilitate communication across providers. And again, of course, being used to evaluate clinical in the context of clinical trials. So again, we really want to make sure, again, with the collaboration with the people with lived experiences, it helps us to make sure that the measurement outcomes are relevant to people living with long COVID and clinicians and researchers. And I've got so many things going on my screen. I've got to actually quite sorry about this. Oops. Okay. Other considerations. I mean, ultimately the goal, and we've got Kelly in the room as well, and I think Anne is here as well, and other members of the team will be happy to answer more specific questions that you might have. So ultimately, we want to have a framework that can provide sort of an overview of the key measurement outcomes for people to consider, and also provide some recommendations on the good quality measures that can be used in different contexts. The proposed approach has two specific steps. The ultimate goal is to build on foundational existing core outcome work, again, with the collaborations nationally and internationally, with the different groups already working in this area. So the first step would be an evidence review and environmental scan. And then the second step would be consensus-based consultation with ranking process with all the key stakeholders who are part of the team and beyond. So the proposed approach, again, is to identify what are the important constructs or domains that we need to be measure with their definitions. We want to understand better how to measure these different constructs, and then what are some key considerations for measurement for use either in clinical practice or research, considering things like respondent burden, ease of interpretability, et cetera, et cetera. some of the expected outcomes. Again, the main outcome would be a framework. And I'm just gonna, sorry, I've got too many things on my screen. There we go. Everything's popping up and I'm on my laptop, so it's not ideal. So again, looking at or providing a framework that can be used, in different research contexts, again, with the key constructs and measures available for different target populations, for different outcomes, et cetera. Really providing a good foundation for people to build upon in the context of their own research or clinical practice. Now, there it goes. So this again is a very much a team approach. Again, we've got collaborations with multiple things. And I think that's really one of the biggest benefits of this research being conducted in the context of the long COVID web, is that we're able to know more about the different research activities going on in this area, and then partner and collaborate with all of these different groups to really build on the work that others have already done, and also including the national or international projects that are ongoing. So where we are, so again, the team has begun and the project is starting. So in the spring, they started the discussions about the need for assessment tools for clinical research. And then really the pooling of interest, which provided the foundation for this proposal or this project. In June, it was reviewed by the Long COVID Web Patient Advisory Council to gain more input from people with lived experiences. And then also shared at the priority meeting that was held in Toronto in June. Our next update was consultations with the Saskatchewan team, and also with Margaret O'Hara from the UK, who's doing comparable work. So in summary, the goal of this project, which again is the first main project come out of Pillar 2 as a true collaboration within the web, is to establish a framework of long COVID measurement that includes relevant, valid, reliable, responsive, and feasible outcome measures to describe, evaluate, and predict outcomes experienced among persons living with long COVID and caregivers for clinical research and practice. Really recognizing the value and importance of measurement, really important highlighting the co-leadership with members from the community, including people with lived experience. We also have a number of stakeholder groups as part of the team, again, with the expected outcome as a framework to guide really research and clinical practice, specifically in the measurement of related variables in the context of long COVID. And that is a wrap up for me. So I'm going to stop sharing so we can go back to any discussion. And there we go.
Thank you very much, Jill. So we'll open the floor up for questions. Jim.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, I would type it, but it would take too long. I apologize. So very nice, Jill. I think this is an important foundational study, and really, really key, because trying to get some sense of the many, many different symptoms, which ones are really the ones to focus on. The question I have and a suggestion, you probably have this input from in British Columbia. We had a collaboration with government support for 5 long COVID clinics and collected standardized questionnaires. The royal we, not me, I didn't lead this, but I'm the science advisor for the BC long COVID clinic group. So they have a lot of data already collected. So is your study going to be a combination of retrospective and new data? How do you propose bringing in, so we don't rebuild the wheel, reinvent the wheel, take advantage of a lot of time, effort, and money spent in probably many sites with large databases, and perhaps putting them together? What's your thought about that?
Well, I'm assuming that will be part of the environmental scan, really, to find out, what measures specifically were included in that data set or in any other data sets that already being routinely collected in the context of clinical practice. So I would think that would be part of the environmental scan, which could then inform the work to be done. And it is, Anne says, so there we go. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There's also from Jennifer, where can we find a summary of all of the clinical trials ongoing, upcoming, and completed, other than the clinical trial registry?
I don't have an answer to that question. I don't know if anybody else does. Angela.
Hi. So yeah, so that's one of the hope is to put all ongoing clinical trials on the long COVID web. And there are big ones, there are small ones, and there are different stages of it as well. Some have finished recruitment, some are just starting. So we're trying to create that space on the long COVID web.
It would be great to have, I'm doing a project right now in spinal cord injury, and their association lists ongoing projects, and we're getting recruitment in that way. So I think that would really facilitate people identifying projects they might want to engage in.
Yeah, and that has been discussed with Nick, who is, I think, here, sort of in charge of the website, and Kiara, who's the communications person as well, and Susan Law as well. So we are working on that, but we want a process where we need to see ethics approval first as well. Like, you know, like most places now require ethics approval for specific wording on websites. Like for studies and stuff. So we want to make sure that there's a standardized process so that it's not just posting things that we know, right? So like, you know, the trials that I'm running, the trials that someone else is running within the web. We want to make sure that it's a standardized process. Yeah, so we're working on that.
We might even be able to provide some recommendations to investigators in advance as they're getting ready to submit their ethics applications.
Yeah.
Thank you. So if we don't have any more questions as of now, we will move forward to Lorraine's talk. Sorry, there's one more. As a matter of curiosity, are insurance companies considered stakeholders within the interest group for the measurement working group?
I don't have an answer to that question. I know Kelly and Anne might have an answer. I didn't see them on the list, but I didn't look carefully.
So I'll mention one thing first, and then maybe Kelly can answer. So certainly insurance companies are a stakeholder for long COVID web. We have had an affiliation with the Canadian Association, the Canadian Health and Life Insurance Association, and they actually wrote supporting letters for long COVID web, and so they have an interest in sort of what we do. So I'll let Kelly talk about the project itself.
Thanks, Angela. Yeah, and Anne's mentioned it in the chat. So to date, we don't have any contacts with insurance companies who have identified an interest in joining as a stakeholder with the measurement group. But if anyone is interested or knows of a particular stakeholder with the measurement piece being of interest, please reach out to us and let us know.
Thank you, Kelly. There's one more question from Mark. Do you have participation from the Living in the North Yukon NWT and NOWAT?
I don't know if Kelly wants to answer that again. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, Mark. Always looking for interest and capacity and engagement from the Yukon Northwest Territories and Nunavut. So if you yourself, or if you know of anybody who might be, again, interested in the measurement piece, please let us know. And also would welcome yourself to join the team as well if you've got the time.
Thank you, Kelly. And there's one last comment before we move on from Tiffany, simply because the recognition of long COVID and indeed for complex health conditions lacking precise biomarkers is delicate with patient power dynamics, etc. And thank you. Okay. So we will move on to our last presentation of the day. Lorraine Graves, our co-chair for our Patient Advisor Council on the Long COVID Web Patient Council updates.
Good morning. Just a note, as you can hear from all the presentations we've seen today, we patients are included every step of the way, from research proposals to research ideas, and we give feedback. We're asked for feedback every step of the way, and we're listened to. Like any other web in reality, all the parts are woven together, and collaboration is the key to success. So I'm Lorraine Graves. I'm co-chair of the Patient Advisory Council for the Long COVID Web. I had COVID March 2020, was quite sick. I've been a broadcast science journalist where I got paid to learn for a living, and it felt like running with the wind in my hair. But thanks to long COVID, I spend most of my day resting my brain and body. So we have a slide about that, as you can see. Karen, if you can put that one up. Next slide. This received a lot of positive feedback on the Facebook group in Canada that has 20,000 people with long COVID. It's our life. So you can get rid of that slide. Now, I can be up about an hour a day, and I'm not alone. I'm co-chair with Daphne Kemp, and the long COVID web has about 300 members, and close to a third of them have long COVID. Some are patient members, and some play two roles as doctor researchers who also have long COVID. And the condition respects no one, be they a child, a stay-at-home mom, a grandma, an Olympic athlete, a business person, or a doctor. We all end up cutting short so much of what we used to be. On the Patient Council, you can see we have representatives from all but one region of Canada, and we're working on that. And we're a dynamic group. Currently, we have 9 patient partners as members, as well as long COVID web staff, and we all work together. We work together and we also still get together 15 minutes earlier or after a meeting to get to know each other as people better. So you can lose that slide, Karen. There's space for 12, and we're going to be filling them in the fall. Equity, diversity, and inclusion is a bedrock of our group, and we're currently working on grounding documents such as terms of reference that will include our recruitment strategy. So stay tuned. We'll be recruiting a few more patient members, especially to fill in any gaps we have. And then this council brings a wealth of skills, perspective, and knowledge to the long COVID web. And for a sampling of the skills, we have a university professor, a physician, a researcher, a floral designer, a business owner, an engineer, a social worker, full-time parents, and a parent of a child with long COVID. Like everyone with long COVID, we are so much more than our condition and our profession. What we do have in common is that we all have long COVID. While we've been together a short time, we've accomplished a lot so far as a council. And the work of some council members started long before the long COVID web was actually established. Some of us worked on the grant proposal, and one of us actually gave the long COVID web its name. We've been working on getting it right, our process, our interactions. So we've really thought about the best way to be heard as a collective group. We're laying down processes to work as a group, to recruit new members, and how to have our voices heard effectively at all stages of research and treatment. We've already had a test run looking at some grant applications where our voice was not only sought, but we made an actual change in what was done and how it was done. It gave us a chance to see how to do this fairly and clearly from a patient's point of view, understanding that some of these patients are also doctors and researchers. It gave us a way to work out a fair process for assessing research proposals from a patient's point of view. Also, we're getting ready for a new call for grant proposals. The long COVID web had a prioritization meeting in June, and 3 people from our committee went, and they were included at every step of the way. The upcoming September two-day long COVID Web Symposium in Montreal will be open to all long COVID Web members, both in person and via Zoom. Not all of us can show up for a two-day conference. As an added feature, both days will have sessions directly aimed at patients and their understanding of what we know so far and where we're going. These sessions will offer ample chances for long COVID patients to ask questions directly to the experts. And what's going to be covered in these patient-oriented sessions is up to the patient council and the organizing committee. We're putting together a long list that we will winnow through and get the questions to be answered. So people with long COVID want and need questions answered by these researchers and clinicians. And moving forward, we're going to continue to hone our processes, add more people with an aim to representation for those who are currently underrepresented. And we're laying the groundwork for working together in a fair and transparent way so we can speak as one voice created out of many. We're here to support the long COVID web as well as the individual pillars and projects in any way we can. Our job is to provide the patient's point of view and our feedback. What has heartened me is that we long haulers are really included every step. From looking over grant proposals where the researchers really listened to our suggestions and they made changes to what research is done, to how patients are treated, and more importantly, how patients should be treated by the medical community. This extends to publications on treatment and publications on diagnosis guidelines for doctors. And also just as many good research projects started with a quirky thing somebody noticed. Patients, too many of us patients aren't heard or were put down for mentioning something quirky. Here, the researchers listen. I watch them, they make notes and they change what they do and they include these quirky things we notice. As the researchers and clinicians of the long COVID web look for ways to figure out who has long COVID, how to treat us, and how to prevent this vile condition, we patients, and specifically the Council for the Long COVID Web, were and are asked our opinions and are asked about our needs every step of the way. And also, in addition to the 4 research pillars, the Long COVID Web has a strong group to get this information out, because the best discoveries in the world are useless until they're used. And as patients, we too take an active role in getting the word out. There are patient groups, long hauler groups, long COVID groups on Facebook, for example, and word gets out very quickly when anything new is found. The Long COVID Web has a long mission statement. They're scientists after all, but their short mission statement to me is profound. A world without long COVID. Are there any questions?
Thank you very much, Lorraine. So Jim has a quick question. You can unmute.
Thanks so much, Lorraine. That's terrific work and a wonderful presentation. Thank you for spending so much time and your energy on this, knowing that you have limited energy, but I think it's terrific work. I think it's a new era. And I suggest that long COVID might be a paradigm shift, not just for long COVID, but for how we do all of our research. And perhaps that's a learning opportunity for researchers in other fields of how this team of clinicians, researchers, and patients is evolving to really work together. I mean, it's a pretty young team in the sense that we only started working together within the last year. And yet I think what I'm hearing is you feel that from your voice, you're hearing terrific progress. And I wonder if there's an opportunity here somehow to publicize this globally as an example that I feel strongly as a clinician researcher that this is the way forward in other fields. You've taught me a lot. I've been able to bring some patient advisors into my own research group, and we found it tremendously advantageous. So what are your thoughts about how we build the story even bigger than long COVID with your media background and your science writing background, and the initiative now with some funding to do this, perhaps there's a bigger message than long COVID. What are your thoughts, Lorraine?
I agree. I applaud CIHR because one of their requirements, if you want money for a research project, it's a Canadian Institute for Health Research, sorry, an acronym, is you have to have patient partners and you have to name them. You can't just say, oh yeah, we're going to do that. You literally need to name who they are. Just like EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion is a bedrock, and you must show who and how you're including people that have been underrepresented. I think you're right, Jim. This is a good start. And bottom line, we're now being treated as experts on what it feels like to have long COVID, what it means. The fatigue and brain fog are the two biggest crushing things for many of us. And fatigue and post-exertional malaise, getting sicker if you just think too hard even, wasn't even included in how to diagnose long COVID for so long. Patients' voices have been heard. It's there now. And there's a new Atlantic Monthly article about exactly that. So I think, yep, we've started something, you've started something. So as a group, and I feel like I'm honored and heard and given space. It's not just, oh yeah, there they go again. We are honored and respected. And I'm amazed as a woman who's dealt with the medical system. Far too often things are just dismissed and said, oh, it's just some quirky thing. Now they're going, really, you noticed that? Okay, and they make a note. So it's lovely. Does that answer your question, Jim?
Yeah, I think the extension, I think maybe there's a process. I'm not putting it on you personally, but maybe the patient group could brainstorm, as I was saying, to make it, tell your example, perhaps through mainstream television media in a way with saying this is important in all fields of research. You referred to the CIHR process, but I think patients in other regions and with other conditions perhaps can rise up, I'll say, and become part of a research process more broadly. That was my point. And so I don't mean to put it on the group specifically, but I guess what I'm saying, it's a terrific example, and we're, it's early days, but it sounds like we're making progress.
I think we're making definite progress, and we're showing how it can be done. And it's great. And we've got a question about Atlantic Canada. And we do have someone in the works that we're talking to about including them, someone with long COVID and who actually has experience as a patient advisor on other research projects. We saw that gap. And while it makes meeting times even more challenging, they're important to include.
Thank you, Lorraine. There is also from Tiffany, will patients suffering from post-vaccine sequela, a syndrome which strongly parallels long COVID, be welcome and have a place within this group? And she also shared a link to a scientific and medical community report.
Thank you for that suggestion. It's something we're looking seriously at. It's vastly more rare, but just as devastating for people who live with post-vaccine effects. And so we'll certainly be looking at it because nobody should be excluded. So thank you for bringing that up. Are there any other questions? If not, I'll go back to what Jim had to say. When what you have is a hammer, the solutions look like a nail. I'm a journalist, a broadcaster, and a print journalist, and I see how powerful traditional media is, and particularly social media. And I can see things ripple through within a day. People change what they do, information gets out. So it's very important as researchers and as patients, we can have direct access to a researcher through tagging someone on Twitter or X and say, is this really happening? Or I've noticed this, am I alone in it? And I've had great response, but I also learn so much from social media that sends me off down other rabbit holes where I learn even more. So are there any more questions?
Yes, so there is one from Bag 848. Is there a larger buy-in from the medical providers regarding more collaborative approaches. The doctors I have had to work with are just looking for a single symptom rather than looking at the overall well-being of their patients.
Ooh, yes, this is a big problem. What is being done is medical journals are now seeking out people in the long COVID web, including patients and researchers, to say, how do we recognize this? How do we diagnose it? And they're putting in guidelines. If you see this, this, and this, and this, likely long COVID, and here's what you should do. So it's starting. I want a cure and a treatment and a diagnosis now. I've lost 3 years of my life, and many have, but research takes time. This is happening very fast, faster than anything I've ever seen, but it's still communicating. The strength of what's happening is this collaboration where there's not these hierarchies and separate silos. Everybody, as you can see, is talking to each other, and they'll say, oh, I found this. Do you want to try that? We've got some of this. Do you want to give it a go? So the researchers are working together, and that's incredibly powerful. And they're listening to us. Yes, they're listening to us every step of the way.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. Is there any more comments? I see that we have no others from the chat. Any last minute comments from any of the speakers?
I just wanted to make one comment. I appreciate I'm talking too much, but I'm enthusiastic about this project. Sometimes my enthusiasm gets ahead of me. I think it would be really useful for as the web emerges and matures, make it easy for patients who want to volunteer to be in studies. You know, if it was a hub, sometimes we find a study through a local connection or through a researcher we know if we're a patient. And I think it would be helpful not only to publicize what are the trials that are ongoing, but how do people with long COVID survey, and there might be a study on brain fog, and someone says, hey, how would I volunteer to be in that? So is that something that's feasible, maybe Angela or Karen? To help patients who want to volunteer to be in trials or in studies from across Canada?
If I can suggest, Jim, the largest group of about 20,000 people in Canada is the COVID Long Haulers Support Group Canada. Long name, cut and paste it in and mail it to yourself. But Susie Golding's on the call. She's the head of this, the reluctant head. And they put out calls for participants all the time. Please answer the 5 W's in your call, because if it's only for people in Sudbury, we'll put it out into a more local group. Otherwise, you'll be getting people from Nunavut trying to sign up, and it will just create more work for you and false hope for them. So the 5 W's, which are 6, who, what, where, when, why, and how, answer that in your call. Put the link in your call, and it should be a clickable link, not just a poster. And I think you'll find people will come out of the woodwork. Also in British Columbia, the government has a way that people can participate in studies, and other provinces may have the same. It's very valuable.
And also I want to say that that's really what we want to put on the long COVID web. We're just working out sort of the process to do that. And there are quite a few studies going on. So we would like to let everyone know about sort of what studies they can help participate in. We just want to establish the process and get it through sort of the patient council looking at it and making sure it makes sense. I think it definitely needs to include the, you know, the W's, 5 or 6 of them, and sort of the link, because what we will do is that people can read more on specific links, right? So, so that's really what we're trying to do.
You know, my observation is I've never met a researcher who wishes a study would go slower, and I've never met a patient who wishes the studies would go slower. So there's such alignment here for pace and for people to work together as researchers and patients. We do want these studies to go quickly because it's going to move the science, but it's more generally going to help patients know which things work and which things might not work.
Yeah,
And what I've been, sorry, Angela.
and I just want to mention Adriana's. So there are multiple long COVID patient support groups. So Susie is definitely have the largest one, but Adriana from Vancouver, BC also has the Long COVID Canada group. Can certainly post research opportunities as well, is what she mentioned. And then there's a kids group as well, right? So if your study has to do with children under 18, then there's a long COVID kids group as well in Canada. So there are multiple groups and we actually work with all of them. Yeah. And recruitment from long COVID clinics work as well. And we have the network of long COVID clinics in Canada. And they are all part of this long COVID web. Some are clinicians and some are research, like sort of physician scientist kind of thing, like myself. So I'm sorry I was late. I was actually in the clinic, as you can see, and was actually seeing not only long COVID patients, but also those with vaccine. I saw 2 this morning, those with vaccine related side effects as well. So definitely there are more long COVID patients, but we do see similarities and we are working on things. So stay tuned.
I just wanted to say the analogy we've had every step of the way is we're designing the airplane as it's taking off on the runway. Many things are happening simultaneously. Everybody involved are highly experienced researchers working together. And it's just such a sense of urgency all over. So I can assure patients work is being done often by researchers who also have long COVID. And they have our best interests at heart because they're also their best interests.
So, our time is up, but there's one last question that we think should be addressed. If people need to go, that's fine. We will post a recorded session on the YouTube channel of Long COVID Web. So the last question is the decades-long research from MECFS being included in Long COVID research? So we'll address that and then get everyone going.
Sure. So maybe I should say something about that. So even from day one, we have had people who, not only patients, but researchers who have been working on MECFS help us. And we have taken their advice on certain things like resting and pacing. So there are some similarities, although sort of there may be also some differences as well between the post-viral COVID syndrome versus other post-infectious disease syndromes. But there are partners within our web from Lyme's disease, from post-EBV and post-various other viral illnesses in the group. So we're certainly paying attention to that. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel. And I want to thank everyone for coming. And I also saw a comment saying it takes a decade to actually move something, and that, well, I would say that the science around COVID has moved much faster. So prior to all of this, it's actually about 15 years from learning something and having the drug to putting it into the clinic. That's not what we see in COVID. We saw, people making Paxlovid and it's already being used, right? So, and certainly hope the same case with long COVID as well. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining today. And thank you to the speakers for sharing sort of what the web has been doing.